Hello and welcome to 5 Ways to Improve Your CV for Pharmacists. For those who don't know me, I'm Stevie from Locum. I'm the marketing lead here, and I'm going to be joined by Melissa McElrath, who's our recruitment consultant in Locum. She's helped hundreds of pharmacists get full-time work through Locum. She's a little bit of our expert in this field. We'll start off with a bit of housekeeping on this webinar. It's on LinkedIn Live. Most of you guys will know how to use LinkedIn. And so what you do to interact with the webinar is you just comment under the post, and we've got a chat function here where we can see all your comments. We have Sarah also joined the call, so she's going to moderate the chat, which is brilliant for us. So she's going to go through all the comments, and if you want us to stop at any point, we can, and we can explain things in a little bit more detail. Another thing is that I anticipate that we're during the working day here, so a lot of people might be watching this on demand. So even if you're not watching it live, we are still available. So you can get our profiles via a link that we're the hosts on this webinar, and you can drop us a message if we cover anything that you really want to know a little bit more about. So without further ado, I'll just go through the agenda, and I'll tell you what we're going to be covering. It's going to be a half-an-hour session. We're going to try and get through a lot of content in half an hour, so hopefully we can do it. So we're going to talk about pharmacy pathways, what's the best fit for you and your skill set, and what knowledge and skills do you need to invest in. So that's like about updating your CV, options and career progression within pharmacy, and like what different routes and paths there are. How to market yourself, which is really important for you, especially in today's day and age where everyone has to put the best foot forward. We're going to talk about interview techniques, and we're going to talk about 5 tips to improve your CV so you get noticed. And then we're going to talk about knockback and recovery. No one likes to be knocked back, but we're going to teach you how to bounce back even stronger. And then we're going to end, if we have time, with a Q&A. And like I say, if you're watching this on demand, drop your questions in either underneath the event, or just directly message myself, Melissa, or even Sarah. I'll pick up some questions. So Melissa, do you want to introduce yourself? Just tell everyone a little bit about yourself, your history, your background, how many pharmacists you place, how great you are at recruitment.
Well, we'll see. No, so I've been with Locum now probably just over 2 years, and I look after the permanent division. So I place candidates into kind of new exciting roles. I've been doing recruitment for just over 10 years. But originally I studied chemistry, so I studied organic chemistry back in Queen's. So recruiting in healthcare it's kind of the same sort of area, but not really. So yeah, that's just kind of my background. I'm kind of a chemist by trade.
Right, well, it's similar, isn't it? Like different elements combining to create the perfect outcome. That's chemistry, isn't it? Isn't that right?
Yeah.
I knew I could get a tedious link in there, Melissa. So we'll go on. No more puns from me. So Melissa, you're going to take people through the different options in pharmacy. Pharmacists will be familiar with this, but Melissa's just going to talk through really briefly in the different options.
Yeah, so there are kind of different routes that you can take and that you can go. So I suppose the primary one's community pharmacy. It is what it is. It says what it is. It's working with the community. It's dealing with customers that come in, prescriptions, working with local GPs, providing services. And most of our roles that we have primarily at the minute are in community. It's just such a vast region and so many roles that need covered in community. Hospital pharmacy, it is kind of similar. It again says what it is. It's working in the hospital, but in hospital you have more opportunity to go a bit more niche. So I've had people that maybe go into like renal or hematology, and it gives you scope to go into a bit more of a speciality. But again, it's dealing with people face to face. It is more kind of hands-on. Alternatively, then I suppose industry is something that's a bit more behind the scenes. So maybe if you're not so much customer facing, you don't really like that interaction, you can have the option of going a bit more behind the scenes. I actually had a role not that long ago that involved kind of research on the Pfizer vaccine. So it was working alongside vaccinators, collating a lot of information about the vaccines and data. But if things went wrong and maybe the vaccine was at wrong temperature or something like that, you had to be there and you had to be hands-on. So it was a bit more behind the scenes and a bit more kind of not as customer facing, which was interesting, really interesting role. And then alternatively, then there's teaching. This is generally where people tend to go to if they've been a pharmacist for a while. Someone that maybe wants to really share the knowledge of what they've gained over the years with newer pharmacists who are starting out. It's very rewarding. But also you kind of, pharmacy is ever evolving. So you do kind of learn some things from newer pharmacists. Online pharmacies are becoming more prevalent as well. So, it's something that, yes, teaching is great to impart your knowledge, but you do learn stuff from the new ones.
I'm going to say you had some clinical roles recently. Where do they fit in here?
So clinical roles are something that fit more into the kind of, I suppose, online pharmacy. They would be a bit more, I suppose, more like industrial. It's a bit more behind the scenes. A lot of clinical roles that we have at the minute are remote roles or hybrid roles, and that seems to be the way that companies are moving at the minute. So they fit into, I suppose, a little bit of industrial, but they do fit into kind of their own little bracket.
Yeah.
We have specialties there like dermatology or aesthetics, for example. It's more speciality in clinical. It's more, I suppose, hands-on. I suppose roles that we have at the minute in clinical are more prescribing roles, so it's a bit more niche.
Yeah.
But they have their little sector.
Brilliant. Yeah, I know there's a lot of interest in the clinical roles from maybe even the audience today. We have a question there. We'll come back to that in the Q&A section. A really good question about hospital pharmacy. We've seen it, and we will promise we'll come back. So what knowledge and skills should you invest in as a pharmacist, Melissa? Like, what do you think is the key sort of things?
I think, to be honest, from a recruitment stance, obviously the more the better. The more skills you have, ultimately the more services you can provide, the more employable you appear. So if you do things like flu jads, for example, or if you've got the prescribing course, you can provide more services, which ultimately, it does increase more revenue for the client. So you will be more employable. But there's things like bonus schemes that people don't talk about an awful lot. You get bonus schemes and services that you provide. So if you provide so many flu jabs, you get a bonus, so it's incentive for you as well. But it depends on what kind of branch I suppose you go into. If you like more community, then I would say focus on the likes of your services, like your flu jabs, your COVID vaccines, prescribing, those sorts of things. It really depends on what you want to do.
Yeah, I suppose like looking into the future, sort of vaccine clinics and like mass centers probably are going to be more prevalent. And so that sort of thing would probably be somewhere you'd want to focus attention. Would you kind of agree with that or no?
Yeah, I think so. And I think as well, a lot of companies, as they are moving more like online as well. So see even things like Excel courses or like Word courses. And as silly as that sounds, but people are using more and more kind of online technology now. So even things like that, if you come from a practicing pharmacist background, you might not necessarily think I need to do a PowerPoint, so even things like that.
Yeah, and I suppose like we're going to cover this later on, but like when you're talking about bolstering your CV, that like a lot of that stuff can be relatable to the skills that pharmacies require.
Yeah, absolutely.
Brilliant. So hopefully we covered all that. Anyone with any questions, you can fire them in, and we will come back. So Melissa, in terms of career progression in community pharmacy, but specifically laser focus on community, what's the typical career progression, or is there a typical career progression?
I think again, it depends on what you want to do. So if you do enjoy that kind of more, I suppose, interaction with patients, if you do enjoy being customer facing, then yes, community is a route for you. If you want to look at a speciality, then maybe hospitals more for you, or industry. It just depends on what you want to do. But just side note, I had a candidate there who was she was a hospital pharmacist by trade, but she really wanted to move more into, I suppose, face-to-face patient interaction. So she kind of thought, well, look, I have skills that sit hospital, but not maybe community, but there are transferable skills. And so we helped her move into a community role, and she's now an area manager for one of the biggest chains in the UK. And at the start, she really did think, I don't know how I'm going to do this. My skills are very niche and special. But we helped her transfer in, and now she's an area manager. So it just depends on what you want to do. In community, there is the route of you can go in as a relief, you can then become a pharmacist in a store, you can be a pharmacy manager, move up to area manager, or you can go into hospital and just be a rotational pharmacist, or you can just stay relief in the community. It really depends on what you want to do. But there's scope for you to go kind of any which way you want.
Yeah, so develop within your role, find out your niche, especially if you're like fairly newly qualified. I suppose you might not know what you want to
Yeah.
specialize in. Getting out there is the way to do it. Is that kind of the feeling?
Yeah, what you tend to find is kind of new qualified pharmacists will go into the likes of a relief role or a locum role, and they will just kind of get to know what's out there. Then that kind of gives you an idea of what you want to do. Maybe community's not for you, and your time in relief, you've you want to go more industrial, and that's fine. But I think that's the kind of route that a lot of people would take whenever they qualify, is just going into like a relief role. And I would say relief roles are great. It's a great opportunity for you to get out there and to see what's there. And a lot of companies, they might not actively have roles, that are there for relief. But if you kind of approach them and say, look, we have roles, or we have a candidate here, for example, we can help you with a relief role.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks. That was a good one. So how to market yourself effectively to get an interview. What we're going to do in this one is we're going to show a good example of a CV and a bad example. Actually, the other way around. Firstly, we're going to show the bad example, and we're going to touch on why it's bad and what the pitfalls are. And then Melissa's going to talk about what makes a good CV. So I'm going to actually flick on from here, the slides on. So this is a bad CV example, and we'll hopefully you can see that on the screen. If you're on your phone, you might struggle, but on the recording afterwards, you can always zoom in. So what's bad about this, Melissa? Like, I can see the red lines already, so saying there's spelling mistakes.
Yeah, so for me, whenever I look at that, the first thing you see is like hobbies and interests, and that shouldn't be the first thing that you see as an employer. The layout's not great, there's a lot of irrelevant information there, but even things like the work history, there's no expansion on it. So as an employer, I would be looking at that and saying, I don't really know what you did in your role. On a CV, yes, okay, you don't want to put 6 lines of what you do as a pre-reg when you've got a more recent role that's relevant, but I think not putting anything at all, it's not great. And I think just tailoring the CV to the role, and I think that's what a lot of people maybe forget, is that you shouldn't really have one CV that fits all. You should have one that you should tailor to different roles. And I think with this CV, it's just very generic, and there's a lot of kind of irrelevant information in it, and it just doesn't read very nice.
Yeah, so format and stuff, the basic stuff, just isn't probably right, is it?
Yeah, I mean, you've got to remember as well, employers see a lot of CVs at one time. They're going to look for ones that stand out, that are, short to the point in what they want to see. So I think if you're looking at something like this where it doesn't have the information they need, they've got to go searching for it. It's just maybe not the best route to go down.
Yeah, typically, would you see employers having a checklist of things that they're looking for, and then looking at the CV against that and going through that checklist? Is that something that happens?
Sometimes, yeah, it depends on the kind of the roles that they do, but usually in a CV, you want to cover your basics. So you'll always have things like your education, you'll always have things like your work experience, and then just a little bit about you, in your personal statement. When you're looking at more pharmacists, things like GPHC number is always a good one to have. If you're specializing in a certain area, or what services you can provide, are always good things to have on your CV. So that's what you kind of tailor to what it is. If it's more community, then yes, put in what services you do. If it's more industrial, then put in, any research experience you have, for example. So kind of tailor it out.
So are you saying, or would you suggest that people alter their CV depending on what role they're applying for? So say you're applying for 2 roles, 2 very different skill sets, or not skill sets, but disciplines. Would you tailor it, or would you keep it as a generic one that covers both?
I mean, usually it's better if you tailor it, to be fair, but I appreciate that, tailoring a CV does take a lot of time. It could just be a case of, having one CV for community and one CV for industry that are just slightly different. It's just minor tweaks. It's just little things like, including more services in one, and, focusing more on industrial in the other. It kind of gives the employer the impression that you're really invested in their role. It makes them think that you're interested in them rather than you're just sending out your CV to everyone.
Okay, brilliant. We'll go on to an example of a good CV now, and then Melissa, like from the outset, like I can tell with my own eyes that this is a better laid out CV, and hopefully even if it's a little bit blurry or small, everyone can see that. But why is this one good?
I think it is just kind of, yes, the layout, everything's just clear and bullet pointed. There's a lot of kind of relevant information in it. So things like work history, there's more focus on their, I suppose, their primary work experience, and then not so much on the pre-reg experience. There's also things like the references and stuff. It's short, it's concise, it's there. And I think just things like hobbies and interests, it's relevant to what they do. So, I think people sometimes have a tendency of putting things in like, I enjoy cycling or Sudoku or whatever it may be. But I think you've got to remember that you're applying for a role. So saying things like, I have a really keen interest in pharmacy journals or things like that kind of keep it relevant to the role. And I think the CV is just a lot better laid out and a lot easier in the eyes as well.
Brilliant. And would you suggest putting references on CVs or available on request?
I think it's really personal preference. You can do either. It doesn't really make much of a difference. Whenever we format a CV, so part of my role, what I do is I would format a CV for a client. So when you work in the role that I do, you get to kind of learn what a client looks for, and you kind of tailor it. So a lot of them we take the references out. And then another little tip is, say, for example, the client really is focused on education or really wants someone to have like a degree in this or that or the other, we would put their education at the top. Whereas if a client's more focused on, okay, you've had 4 years experience or we need 3 years experience for this, we would put their work experience at the top. So whenever we format your CV, that's what we kind of do. And it's kind of just a nice little point that, maybe tailor it around a little bit depending on the client.
Okay, brilliant. And what we're going to do is we're offering like CV clinic. So Melissa or Kieran, who's joined the call, can look at your CVs and give you hints and tips personalized. So we'll share a link post webinar, and you can submit your CV, and they can just give you some feedback like this, similar to this. And it might be your CV is perfect and there's not much feedback. It might be there's a little bit of advice that we can give to help you maximize your potential to get a new role. So we'll share that link afterwards. So we'll move on now. So this is kind of the bulk of the webinar, and this is the purpose of it, the title, or hopefully what got you into the webinar. So 5 tips that you can employ right now. I've probably covered some of them briefly there, but we're going to work through them in a numerical way where we can expand a little bit. So we'll move on to the next slide. So Melissa, do you want to talk through these?
Yeah, can do. So yeah, I think be strategic is I suppose the primary one. Make sure it's not a list of everything you've done. You don't want to put in every single thing that you've done. Keep it clear, concise. Put in your relevant information. And I suppose just no gaps in employment is a big thing. Even if it's you've taken a year out or you've gone traveling or whatever it may be, just make sure there's no gaps in employment. All your dates tally up. And yeah, just make sure you put in everything relevant. I can't stress enough that you don't want to put in anything that's just nonsense.
Yeah, I think like the dates thing, like the marrying up is so important. Like you do see some CVs that it's overlapping dates and things, and it makes you like ask a question. You probably shouldn't have that. There's questions being asked about simple things like that, should you?
No, and then I've seen CVs where maybe someone appears to be in 5 different roles at one time, and you're kind of thinking, okay, it's just a case of just ending one and putting present in the other, and it doesn't look like you're in 6 places at once.
Okay, brilliant.
I think as well, and so keeping it consistent is the main thing. You can choose any font, it doesn't really matter. An employer doesn't really mind if it's in Comic Sans or whatever it may be, so just make sure it's the same throughout. You don't want to have one heading that maybe stands out over and above the rest. If you're maybe putting a title in bold, put them all in bold. Just make it consistent and make sure it's the same the whole way through. What we tend to do for CVs is things like job title, we would put bold and italic, and then just underneath that you would have nice little bullet points of your job, and things like references on a quest. We would put that in bold as well. For example, your personal statement, we would maybe make it stand out a little bit. So just keep it consistent. And again, I think the best sort of format is title and then bullet point your experience, and I think that just looks nicer. It's clear, it's quick, it's easy for the employer to read.
Brilliant. Yeah, and like there's probably formats online and things that you can look up the best practice, isn't there, Melissa? Like I'm sure we do best practice, so I'm sure we can get that somewhere to people.
Yeah, I mean, there is CV templates and stuff you can use, but I suppose there is ultimately kind of no right or wrong. You can put in what you want to put in, and everything's going to be relevant at some point, So I think it's just trying to keep in mind who you're trying to target with your CV, who are you trying to send it to, and just try and keep it as clear for them as you can. But ultimately, there's no wrong way to do it. As long as you don't have like loads of spelling mistakes and this and the other, then you're all right.
Yeah, no one likes those red lines, do they? Especially when you're looking at it on your computer. It doesn't look pretty.
Exactly. Get rid of the squiggles, yeah.
Brilliant.
So I think then, yeah, a variety of experiences and interests. This is one that's kind of, I don't want to say a hot topic, but this is something that comes up a lot, with your experiences and your interests. Do you keep it in? Do you take it out? And again, there's no right or wrong. I think if you are going to put in like a hobbies and interest section, I know we've mentioned briefly, but keep it very close to what you want to do, or things like, enjoy reading pharmacy journals, or don't put anything that's maybe irrelevant. Keep it that's something that's related to your role. And I suppose just try and keep it as clear and concise as you can.
Okay, brilliant. Now we'll move on to the next slide, the last two. Number 4 there, Melissa, do you want to talk through that one?
Yeah, so think like an employer. This is just really, if you were to read it, for example, so if I was looking at a CV, I would read it how, an employer would read it. So when you're writing a CV, try and think of it that way. What do you want to include? What do you really want to sell about yourself? What skills do you have that would really be beneficial to the employer? You want to put that on your CV. So say, for example, if you've done independent prescribing, it's no easy task. Make sure you put it on there. Make sure it's pronounced and it's there. And then just kind of going back to the, if the first essential criteria is a qualification, so you must have a master's or you must have a prescribing qualification, put your education first at the top of your CV. So put your personal statement and then put your education. If it says, 3 years experience, well then put your work experience first and put your education underneath. Then put like a little hobbies and interests and then your references. So I suppose that's the kind of the main format that it should take, is usually personal statement and then either education or work experience, a little bit about your hobbies and interests, any skills you have, and then just a wee reference part at the bottom.
How far back would you go with accreditations and skills? So like say you'd done that course before you went to university, for example, but you thought it was relevant. Would you put it in your CV or would you keep it out?
If it's relevant, absolutely keep it in. It doesn't really matter when you've done it. I think not really the problem, but I think whenever you're looking at a CV, if somebody's maybe gone back, to working in your local newsagents whenever you were 14, that doesn't really affect applying for a pharmacy role. So things like that, you can take things like that out of your CV. I think people think you have to put everything in your CV, everything has to be there, but if it was 20, 30 years ago, it doesn't really make much of a difference to your CV. You can just say other work experience provided or previous work experience provided on request. It doesn't have to be in there.
Brilliant. And the last one's pretty self-explanatory.
Yeah, spelling. This is something I'm really stickler for. I will double and triple check CVs because I have had so many instances where clients have come back and be like, well, there's spelling mistakes on that. How are they going to do this, that, or the other? So I cannot stress enough, just double, triple check everything you write in. Even grammar, things like a full stop at the end of a sentence, it does get noticed by clients. Things like that do get noticed. So yeah, absolutely. Double, triple, quadruple check.
No, I'm worried this presentation has some spelling mistakes.
I checked those are all right.
So interview techniques, moving away from the CV and thinking about the actual interview. How do you seal the deal? Like, what's good practice in an interview? Is there any tips you've learned along the lines, things that have helped the successful candidates get those jobs? Like anything you can sort of shed some light on?
So I think once you kind of have that CV, you've got to remember your CV is like the first way into the client. It's the first thing they see. So that's kind of like the first hurdle. And once you pass that, you're like, okay, what's the next stage? So the next stage is, meeting with the pharmacy owner, meeting with the HR, depending on who it is. And they can be very different. Pharmacy owners, when they review a CV, might not be looking at it the same way an HR business partner would, for example. It depends on the client. And I think you've got to kind of keep that in mind. And that's why I think tailoring CVs is a good route to go. If you're applying for a small independent in your local town, they're not really going to look at a CV the way, an HR business partner for a chain would. So try and keep that in mind. But to be honest, most interviews kind of take the same sort of pattern. It's usually, okay, what do you know about us? And you kind of just make sure you do your research on a company, no matter what, make sure you research the company. Even knowing things like how long they've been operational or how many stores they have, just things like that show that you have a real interest in them. So they'll ask you, what do you know about us? And then why should I employ you? So that's a question that I suppose I get asked a lot. How should I answer that? So answer along the lines of, from my CV, you can see that I've got skills such as X, Y, Z. They correlate with the work experience that you're looking for. However, what makes me stand out is my passion to work in the community or how I interact with the public. And just try and keep it as tailored to the job description as possible. And I think when you're answering questions in an interview, try to keep them as close to the job description as possible and always try and keep it in mind. You'll always get asked questions like, where do you see yourself in 5 years' time? And I think the way to approach that is something like, you want to progress your skills, you want to look at a career in the sector that you're most passionate about, and again, just try and keep it that you're really invested and passionate in that company. Salary negotiations is another one that we get asked an awful lot. Now, the good thing about us in Locum Locum is we do that for you on your behalf, so you don't have to have that awkward conversation of, okay, what do I ask for? And I think it's fear as well. There's the fear of kind of, do you ask for too much or too little, and you don't want to undersell yourself. But what we do here is we would get to know you, and we would look at roles that kind of best fit you. So this will be things like salaries as well, and even things like market averages and things like that we would know. So even if you are doing it yourself and you are wanting to negotiate yourself, always have an idea of kind of what salaries are in the area and what salaries are kind of based on your skills and experience. And I think when you are looking at things like negotiations, try and talk about, well, based on my skills and my experience, I could bring this to the role, so therefore I feel like my value to this role would be this. But do try and remember as well that a lot of companies will pay things like registration fees or parking or bonuses. So that will ultimately be part of your kind of salary package. And I think people sometimes get too tied up on what your base salary would be. So try and think of it as an overall package as well. But ultimately, don't kind of undersell your worth. Know kind of what you're worth. And use recruiters like me, to get things like the average as well. So you can use that in negotiations.
Yeah, that's brilliant advice, Melissa. I think you covered everything I was going to ask there. And then this one's probably one of the most important. Like, how do you deal with rejection, like, and knockbacks? Like, it's going to happen to everyone, especially if there's demand for or high supply for the demand of the role.
It does happen, and I think that the main thing you got to think is just try and be positive. I know it's like a knock, and you might want to go and have like a glass of wine after, but you'll be okay. Everyone gets it. Yes, you get rejected, but I think ultimately what you've got to look at is, what did you learn from it? I had a candidate, for example, she was rejected, but it was her first interview that she had in 15 years. And I think she was really nervous going into it, but what she learned from that was, what questions you get asked, what do you expect, what sort of questions will come your way. Yes, you might get the odd kind of, I suppose, curveball, but the techniques that you learn in an interview, they're invaluable. So even things like the STAR technique, so thinking of a situation, a task, what action did you take and what result did you have, things like that. And I think as well, when you get asked a question that you don't know, just breathe. Sometimes you just take a breath and you do clam up. And it's happened to me where I completely clammed up and I've just had to say, I'm really sorry. I can't think of how to answer this question. But, next time you will know how to answer it. And I think it's just what you kind of learn from it. And the main thing is just feedback. Try and get feedback where you can. It's always invaluable to have it. And just don't let it get to you. It happens to everybody.
Okay, brilliant. We're on 28 minutes. The timing is absolutely impeccable. I think so. We're going to quickly, the resources, I've kind of touched on this before. We have a full help center there. We have a career section on the help center. So there's some resources on there that are really helpful. Some of the stuff Melissa's talked about. There's loads of training courses and accreditations. We can send you a link to those in the follow-up email here. And then, as I mentioned, the guys are more than willing to do some one-to-one feedback on CVs. So after this webinar, everyone who's attended and registered, I will send that link and you can submit your CV. And then I'll pass it to Melissa, who's been presenting, or Kieran, who's also on here, who can give you some feedback and sort of where to go next. So we've got a question here. I'm going to put it on the screen and I'll read it out as well, just to make it easy for Melissa. It might be a tough one, but hopefully. And so Noor's asking, is there any tips for community trainee pharmacists to apply for a hospital role? Any tips to be more outstanding than trainees who have done their training in hospital? It's a really good question. What do you think, Melissa?
Yeah, no, it is. It's a really good question. I think anything you can do over and above. I think people get too focused on, paid work and things that they've maybe done in the past, but even things like, volunteering. Go to your local hospital, volunteer for a while. They're always open to having volunteers, and even having that kind of knowledge of how the hospital pharmacy runs, how a ward would run, is invaluable as well. So I think things like that, maybe doing some volunteering, maybe doing a lot of reading. There's any sorts of resources that you can use in terms of like a day in the life of a hospital pharmacist to kind of get to know what the role is. And I think that puts you in a better position that, ultimately when you do go for that role, you've got the experience behind you, and you kind of know to a certain extent what you're talking about. And I think as well, having experience from community is also invaluable. You know, you've got that experience with talking to people and dealing with the public, and you know, you will have transferable skills that you can transfer across. So I think that'd be my advice.
Okay, brilliant. Hopefully that answers the question. If you need any clarification, just drop us a message, or you can even just come into the comments again. Sarah, is there anything else that I'm missing on the questions? We've got some people just saying great webinar and things, but is there anything I'm missing questions wise? Give 30 seconds and then we'll wrap up. We're just over time, but I'm just conscious that it's good to have us live on here, and you get an immediate answer rather than have to wait. So it doesn't look like there's anything else coming through. So that's brilliant, like right on time. So firstly, thanks to everyone who's attended live, and thanks to everyone who's watching on demand. And we can help you with any sort of recruitment tips or advice. Melissa, thank you so much for your time today. It was a really comprehensive presentation. I think you covered like everything that you can think of in a recruitment process.
Yeah, I think that's the thing. Whenever it comes to recruitment, it's just so open-ended. There's always questions. So any questions, feel free to shoot them over.
Okay, brilliant. And like I say, there's always the opportunity to chat to the team. Really approachable bunch. They're at the other end of the LinkedIn Messenger. So if you do have a question, pop it through to them and they can pick it up and give you some hints, tips and advice on recruitment or interview techniques or CV formatting or whatever it might be. Melissa might even do some grammar lessons. What do you reckon, Melissa? To get
yeah,
the CV
definitely. Yeah.
Brilliant. Well, I'll end it there. So thank you very much for joining us. Thanks to Sarah for moderating, Melissa for presenting, and Kieran, thanks for being here and agreeing to the CV clinic afterwards. So thank you very much, guys.
Thank
Speak
you.
again soon. Bye.
Bye.